The morning sun filtered through the massive, transparent dome of Kepler Station, casting long shadows across the polished metal floors of the Galactic Military Academy. Jake Morrison walked through the corridors with his head down, clutching his datapad tightly against his chest. He could hear the whispers and quiet laughter from the other students as he passed, but he tried his best to ignore them. Jake was the only human in his class, maybe even the only human in the entire academy. His brown hair was cut short in military fashion, and his green eyes held a determination that most of his alien classmates failed to notice. They were too busy seeing him as the odd one out, the representative of a species that had only joined the Galactic Federation 20 years ago. The Strategic Warfare classroom was located on the 10th level of the academy, with large windows that looked out into the star-filled void of space. Jake took his usual seat in the back corner, away from the main groups of students who clustered together based on their species. The Celestians sat together with their silver hair shimmering under the artificial lights, their pale skin almost glowing. The Saurians formed their own group, their scaled bodies creating a rainbow of colors from deep green to bright orange. The ethereals floated in a loose circle, their translucent forms barely visible except for the soft blue light that emanated from within them. Professor Zektar entered the room with heavy footsteps that echoed off the metal walls. He was a Vorthan, standing nearly 8 feet tall with skin that looked like it was made of purple crystal. His voice boomed across the classroom as he placed his teaching materials on the desk at the front of the room. "Today we begin our final project for this semester," Professor Zektar announced, his crystal skin catching the light as he moved. "You will be studying banned military tactics throughout galactic history. Each group will be assigned a different set of restricted warfare methods to analyze and present to the class." Jake felt his stomach drop as he heard the word group. He looked around the classroom and saw that all the other students had already formed their teams based on species lines. He was going to be working alone again. Just like every other major assignment this semester, Professor Zektar continued speaking as he activated the holographic display at the front of the room. "Some of these banned tactics date back thousands of years when our various civilizations were still learning how to conduct warfare in a civilized manner. Others are more recent additions to the restricted list." A student named Lyra raised her hand. She was Celestian with the typical silver hair and luminous blue eyes of her people. Her voice had a musical quality that made everything she said sound elegant and refined. "Professor, what kinds of tactics could be so terrible that they needed to be banned entirely?" Professor Zektar's crystal skin darkened slightly, which Jake had learned was the Vorthan equivalent of a serious expression. "Methods that were deemed too destructive, too inhumane, or too dangerous for civilized warfare. Tactics that violated the basic principles of honorable combat that our galaxy has maintained for millennia." Jake noticed several students turning to look at him with smirks on their faces. He knew what was coming next, and sure enough, Professor Zektar's voice took on a particular tone as he mentioned the next item on his list. "One of the most recent additions to the banned tactics list are the human restriction protocols," the professor said, and Jake could feel every eye in the room turning toward him. These protocols were established shortly after humanity joined the Federation, restricting 37 specific combat methods that human forces had developed. The laughter started quietly, but quickly spread throughout the classroom. Crix, a Saurian student with emerald green scales, turned to his friends and spoke just loud enough for Jake to hear. 37 banned tactics from the newcomers? What did they do, learn how to throw rocks really hard?" Lyra giggled, covering her mouth with her delicate hand. "I heard humans used to fight with primitive projectile weapons that made loud noises. How scary could they possibly be?" Vane, one of the ethereal students, floated closer to the group. His translucent form shimmered as he spoke in the telepathic voice that all ethereals used. "My grandfather served in the Rim Wars before humans joined the Federation. He said they were just lucky in their first contact battles. No real strategy, just reckless charging and hoping for the best." Jake felt his face burning with embarrassment and anger, but he forced himself to stay quiet. He had learned during his first semester that defending his species only made the mockery worse. The other students seemed to think that any reaction from him proved their point about humans being primitive and overly emotional. Professor Zektar cleared his throat, and the laughter died down. As I was saying, you will be working in groups to research and present on these various band tactics. I will now assign your topics. Jake watched as the professor called out group assignments. The Celestian team received classical Vorthan, siege techniques, methods that had been banned for being too slow and causing unnecessary suffering to civilian populations. The Saurian group got ancient ethereal mind warfare, psychological tactics that had been restricted for being too invasive of personal mental privacy. The ethereal team was assigned early Celestian battle symphonies, combat methods that had been banned because they were considered too beautiful and distracted other species from proper military focus. Finally, Professor Zektar's gaze fell on Jake. Morrison, you will be researching pre-Federation human military doctrine and the reasoning behind the human restriction protocols. The laughter that followed was louder this time. Jake heard Crick's hiss with amusement. Poor Jake gets the joke assignment. What is he going to write about? How humans discovered that pointy sticks work better than rocks? Lyra turned to her teammates with a wide smile. Maybe he can explain how humans learned to make fire and use it as a weapon. That would probably count as advanced tactics for them. Vane's ethereal form pulsed with what Jake had learned was the ethereal version of laughter. I wonder if human tactics include running away very fast. That might explain how they survived long enough to reach space. Jake clenched his fists under his desk, trying to keep his expression neutral. He had grown up hearing stories about human military history from his grandfather, who had served in the Earth Defense Force before first contact. Those stories painted a very different picture of human warfare than what his classmates believed. But Jake had never seen any actual evidence to support them. Professor Zektar dismissed the class, and Jake quickly gathered his things and headed for the door. As he walked past Lyra's group, he heard her talking to her friends about their project. We are so lucky we got the Celestian battle symphonies, she said with obvious relief. Can you imagine having to write about human tactics? What would there even be to research? Their entire military history probably fits on a single data pad. Her friend nodded in agreement. The professor probably gave Jake that assignment because he felt sorry for him. How embarrassing would it be to research your own species and find out there is nothing impressive to write about? Jake left the classroom feeling more determined than ever to prove them wrong, but he had no idea how he was going to do it. As far as he knew, the stories his grandfather had told him were just stories. He had never seen any official records or documentation that supported the idea that humans had been anything more than lucky primitives who stumbled into galactic civilization. Walking through the corridors toward the Academy library, Jake made a decision. He was going to research human military history more thoroughly than any of his classmates researched their topics. Even if he only found evidence that humans were primitive, at least he would know the truth. And maybe, just maybe, he would find something that would make his classmates think twice about their assumptions. The library was located in the central hub of Kepler Station, with data terminals that could access archives from across the galaxy. Jake settled into a quiet corner and began his search, not knowing that he was about to discover truths that would change everything he thought he knew about his own species. Jake spent the next 3 days buried in the Academy library, searching through basic records about human military history. Most of what he found matched what his alien classmates believed about his species. The early records showed humans using simple projectile weapons, basic armor, and straightforward battle tactics that seemed primitive compared to the elegant warfare methods of other galactic civilizations. But something bothered Jake about these records. They all seemed to end abruptly, around the time of first contact with the Federation. Everything before that point was marked as either classified or restricted access. Jake had seen restricted files before in his other classes, but never this many covering such a long period of time. On the 4th day, Jake decided to apply for access to the classified archives. As a student researching an official assignment, he had the right to request permission to view restricted materials. He filled out the proper forms and submitted them to the archive department, not expecting much to come of it. To his surprise, his request was approved within hours. The approval came with a note that made him pause. The archive keeper had written that Jake's human heritage gave him automatic access to files related to human military history, regardless of their classification level. This seemed odd to Jake because none of his alien classmates had mentioned having special access to their own species' historical records. Jake made his way to the restricted archives section, which was located deep in the lower levels of the station. The corridors here were dimmer and quieter than the main academic areas. Few students ever came down this far, and Jake passed only a handful of researchers and faculty members as he walked. The archive keeper was an elderly alien named Oldith, who belonged to a species Jake had never seen before. Oldith had multiple eyes scattered across his large, bulbous head, and his skin was a mottled gray color that seemed to shift and change in the artificial light. His voice was soft and careful when he spoke to Jake. "Young human, you have requested access to some very old and very restricted files," Oldith said, his many eyes blinking in a pattern that Jake found unsettling. "These records were sealed by order of the Federation Council. Are you certain you wish to see what your ancestors were capable of?" Jake nodded firmly, though he felt a chill run down his spine at the archive keeper's words. "I need to understand why the human restriction protocols exist. It is for my class assignment." Oldith studied Jake for a long moment, his eyes moving independently of each other as they focused on different parts of Jake's face. "Very well, but I must warn you, young one. Some knowledge changes a person forever. Once you see these files, you cannot unsee them." The archive keeper led Jake to a private viewing room with a single data terminal and no windows. The walls were lined with sound-dampening material, and Jake noticed that the door sealed completely when Oldith closed it behind them. This level of security seemed excessive for historical records, but Jake was too curious to turn back now. Oldith activated the terminal and entered a series of complex access codes. "The files you are about to see cover human military activities from approximately 500 Earth years before first contact. They include combat footage, tactical analyses, and strategic documents that were surrendered to the Federation as part of humanity's admission requirements." Jake sat down at the terminal as thousands of files appeared on the screen. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming. Human military history apparently contained far more material than he had ever imagined. He selected the first file, which was labeled as a basic overview of human warfare evolution. What Jake read in that first document made his hands shake. The file described something called the Geneva Conventions, which were apparently a set of rules that human militaries had agreed to follow during wartime. But as Jake read further, he realized these were not restrictions placed on humans by a superior authority. These were rules that humans had created for themselves to limit how destructive their wars could become. The document explained that humans had developed weapons and tactics that were so devastating that they had voluntarily banned themselves from using them. Jake found this concept almost impossible to understand. Every other species in the galaxy had their warfare methods, limited by external authorities or by the natural limitations of their technology. Humans appeared to be the only species that had created weapons they were afraid to use. Jake opened the next file, which contained a tactical analysis of something called World War II. The document was filled with terms and concepts that Jake had never encountered before. Total war, strategic bombing, combined arms tactics, asymmetric warfare. Each term was linked to detailed explanations and examples that made Jake's head spin. As he read, Jake began to understand that human warfare had evolved in a completely different direction than the warfare of other galactic species. Where other civilizations fought for limited political goals with honorable methods, humans had apparently learned to wage war for the complete destruction of their enemy's ability and will to fight. The files showed that humans had developed the concept of targeting not just enemy military forces, but enemy industrial capacity, supply lines, civilian morale, and even the basic infrastructure that allowed enemy societies to function. This was so different from standard galactic warfare doctrine that Jake had trouble believing what he was reading. Meanwhile, back in the main academy areas, Jake's alien classmates were making steady progress on their own assignments. During lunch in the cafeteria, they often discussed their research projects while continuing to mock Jake's assignment. Lyra sat with her Celestian teammates, reviewing notes about their assigned topic. "The battle symphonies are fascinating," she told her friends. "Our ancestors conducted warfare like a beautiful dance with formations that moved in perfect harmony. Every battle was a work of art." Crix hissed with pride as he talked about Saurian military tactics. "My people perfected the swift strike method. Quick, decisive battles that ended conflicts with minimal casualties and maximum honor for both sides, very civilized." Vane floated near the group, his ethereal form shimmering with excitement. The ethereal mind warfare techniques were incredible. "Our ancestors could defeat enemies without any physical violence at all, simply by convincing them that fighting was pointless." One of Lyra's teammates looked toward the empty chair where Jake usually sat. "Where is Jake today? Still trying to find something impressive about human rock throwing?" Crix laughed, his scales changing color slightly with amusement. "Maybe he discovered that humans learned to throw rocks in formation. That would probably count as advanced tactics for them." Vane's form pulsed with the ethereal equivalent of laughter. "I heard that human weapons made loud noises to scare their enemies. Imagine being so primitive that you think noise is an effective weapon." The group's laughter attracted attention from other nearby tables, and soon students from multiple species were sharing jokes about human military capabilities. None of them had any idea that just a few levels below them, Jake was discovering truths about his species that would fundamentally change how they saw humanity. Back in the archive room, Jake opened a file labeled Nuclear Warfare Doctrine and immediately wished he had not. The images and descriptions contained in that file were unlike anything he had ever seen or imagined. Entire cities reduced to ash in seconds, landscapes poisoned for decades, weapons capable of ending all life on a planet. But what truly shocked Jake was not that humans had created such weapons, but that they had created them and then chosen not to use them in most conflicts. The files showed a concept called mutually assured destruction, where humans had built enough nuclear weapons to destroy their own planet several times over, but had used this overwhelming destructive power to prevent wars rather than to fight. Jake closed the file and sat back in his chair, his mind reeling from what he had learned. His alien classmates thought humans were primitive because they made loud noises with their weapons and fought with simple tactics. They had no idea that humans had voluntarily restricted themselves to primitive methods because their advanced methods were too terrible to use. As Jake prepared to delve deeper into the files, he began to understand why the archive keeper had warned him about knowledge that changes a person forever. He was learning that everything his classmates believed about humanity was not just wrong, but completely backwards. Humans were not banned from using advanced tactics because they were too primitive to develop them. They were banned from using their tactics because those tactics were too advanced for galactic civilization to tolerate. Jake spent the entire next week in the restricted archives, and what he discovered made him question everything he thought he knew about his own species. The files contained footage and documents spanning hundreds of years of human warfare, and each new discovery was more shocking than the last. The first video file Jake opened showed something called the Blitzkrieg tactics from World War II. He watched in amazement as human forces moved with mechanical precision across entire continents, using coordinated attacks with ground troops, armored vehicles, and aircraft that overwhelmed their enemies before they could react. The speed and efficiency of these attacks was unlike anything Jake had seen in his studies of galactic warfare, but what truly surprised Jake was how quickly human forces adapted to enemy countermeasures. When their enemies learned to defend against the fast attacks, humans immediately developed new methods. They created something called combined arms, tactics where different types of military units worked together in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. Far beyond what any single unit could achieve alone, Jake found records of battles where small human forces had defeated much larger enemy armies by using terrain, weather, and even the time of day as weapons. He read about something called asymmetric warfare, where humans would refuse to fight on their enemies' terms and instead create entirely new types of conflict that their opponents were not prepared for. The more Jake read, the more he realized that human military thinking was fundamentally different from every other species in the galaxy. Other civilizations seemed to fight wars like games with established rules that everyone agreed to follow. Humans fought wars like problems that needed to be solved by any means necessary. Jake opened a file about something called economic warfare and discovered that humans had learned to defeat enemies without ever fighting them directly. They would target enemy supply lines, trade routes, and industrial capacity until their opponents could no longer afford to continue fighting. Some of these economic campaigns had lasted for decades and had brought down entire empires without a single battle. Another file described psychological warfare techniques that made Jake's skin crawl. Humans had developed methods for breaking enemy morale that were so effective they could cause entire armies to surrender without firing a shot. They used propaganda, disinformation, and terror tactics that attacked the enemy's will to fight, rather than their physical ability to wage war. But the most disturbing files were the ones labeled Total War. Jake read with growing horror about conflicts where humans had decided that their enemy's entire society was a legitimate target. Civilian infrastructure, food production, transportation networks, even cultural sites were destroyed to break the enemy's ability to support their military forces. Jake found footage of cities burning for days, of farmland poisoned so it could not grow crops, of entire populations forced to flee their homes as human forces advanced. The level of destruction was so complete that it seemed designed not just to win wars, but to ensure that the defeated enemy could never fight again. As Jake watched these videos, he began to understand why other galactic species found human warfare so terrifying. Every other civilization he had studied fought wars to achieve specific political goals while trying to minimize long-term damage. Humans seemed to fight wars to eliminate the very possibility of future wars by completely destroying their enemies. Capacity for organized resistance. Jake opened a file about biological warfare and immediately regretted it. The documents described weapons that could kill specific ethnic groups while leaving others unharmed, diseases that could be spread through air or water supplies, and toxins that could make entire planets uninhabitable for centuries. What made these weapons even more terrifying was that humans had developed most of them and then chosen not to use them because they understood the consequences too well. The nuclear warfare files were even worse. Jake watched test footage of weapons that could destroy entire continents and read strategic plans for conflicts that would have ended all human civilization. But again, what shocked Jake most was not that humans had created these weapons, but that they had built enough of them to destroy their own planet multiple times over and then used this overwhelming power to prevent wars rather than fight them. Found records of something called the Cold War, where two human superpowers had aimed thousands of nuclear weapons at each other for decades, but never used them because both sides understood that any nuclear conflict would result in the complete destruction of human civilization. The level of restraint required to maintain such a situation seemed almost impossible to Jake. On his 7th day in the archives, Jake discovered the most shocking files of all. These were labeled unconventional warfare and contained tactics that no other galactic species had ever conceived. Humans had developed methods for fighting wars using weather modification, computer viruses, artificial plagues, and even manipulation of planetary geology to create earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Jake read about something called fourth generation warfare, where humans would defeat enemies by turning their own populations against them. They would use media, religion, economics, and social pressure to cause enemy societies to collapse from within without any direct military action at all. But the file that truly terrified Jake was labeled Information warfare. This described human methods for controlling what entire populations believed to be true. Humans had learned to manipulate news, education, entertainment, and even personal communications to shape how people thought about reality itself. Jake realized that an enemy facing these tactics might not even know they were at war until they had already lost. As Jake sat in the quiet archive room surrounded by centuries of human military innovation, he began to understand why the Galactic Federation had banned human warfare methods. It was not because humans were too primitive to fight properly. It was because human warfare had evolved far beyond what galactic civilization considered acceptable or even comprehensible. Every other species in the galaxy seemed to view war as a temporary interruption of normal politics that should be conducted according to civilized rules. Humans had learned to view war as a fundamental breakdown of civilization that required the complete restructuring of reality to resolve. Jake closed the files and leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning from everything he had learned. Tomorrow he would have to face his classmates again, knowing that every joke they made about primitive human tactics was not just wrong but dangerously naive. They had no idea that the primitive species they mocked had voluntarily restricted itself to using methods that other civilizations would consider advanced, but Jake was not sure what he was going to do with this knowledge. How could he explain to Lyra that her elegant battle symphonies would be considered a minor tactical exercise by human standards? How could he tell Crix that human forces had routinely defeated enemies 10 times their size using methods that Saurian swift strikes could not even comprehend? How could he make Vane understand that human psychological warfare made ethereal mind techniques look like children's games? As Jake prepared to leave the archives, he realized that his real problem was not proving that humans were more advanced than other species thought. His real problem was going to be explaining why humans had chosen to hide their true capabilities and accept being seen as primitive newcomers to galactic civilization. The answer to that question was buried somewhere in the remaining files, and Jake knew he would have to find it before he could face his classmates with the truth about what humanity was really capable of in war. Jake walked into the strategic warfare classroom on presentation day with his datapad loaded with enough classified footage to change galactic history. He had spent 2 weeks in the restricted archives, and the knowledge he carried now felt like a weight on his shoulders. His classmates were chatting excitedly about their presentations, still making jokes about his assignment whenever they thought he could not hear them. Professor Zektar called the class to order, his crystal skin reflecting the morning light streaming through the dome windows. Today you will present your research on banned military tactics. We will begin with the Celestian team. Lyra stood gracefully and activated the holographic display. Her presentation showed elegant formations of Celestian warriors moving across battlefields like dancers performing a complex ballet. The battle symphonies were beautiful to watch, with perfect coordination and artistic precision that made warfare look like a form of high art. The Celestian battle symphonies were banned because they were considered too beautiful, Lyra explained with obvious pride. Other species became so distracted by the elegance of our formations that they forgot to defend themselves properly. The Federation decided this gave us an unfair advantage. Her teammates nodded approvingly as they showed footage of Celestian forces creating geometric patterns while they fought, their silver armor gleaming as they moved in perfect unison. The presentation lasted 15 minutes and received enthusiastic applause from the other students. The Saurian team went next, with Crix presenting their research on swift strike tactics. The holographic display showed Saurian forces moving with incredible speed across battlefields, their scaled armor changing colors to match their surroundings, as they launched surprise attacks that ended conflicts within hours. Saurian tactics were banned because they ended wars too quickly. Crix explained, his green scales shifting to a proud golden color. Our ancestors could defeat any enemy before they had time to surrender properly. The Federation felt this did not give our opponents enough opportunity to negotiate peaceful solutions. The Saurian presentation showed battles that looked more like high-speed chases than traditional warfare, with Saurian forces appearing and disappearing so quickly that their enemies barely had time to react. The class applauded enthusiastically when the presentation ended. The ethereal team floated to the front of the classroom, with Vane's translucent form shimmering as he began their presentation. The holographic display showed ghostly figures moving through enemy positions without being detected, using telepathic abilities to confuse and disorient their opponents. Ethereal mind warfare was banned because it was considered too invasive of personal mental privacy, Vane explained, his voice echoing strangely in the minds of everyone present. Our ancestors could defeat enemies by convincing them that fighting was pointless, but the Federation decided that entering enemy minds without permission was unethical. The ethereal presentation showed battles where enemy forces simply stopped fighting and walked away, apparently convinced by telepathic suggestion that they had more important things to do elsewhere. The class found this both fascinating and slightly disturbing, but they applauded politely when the presentation finished. Finally, Professor Zektar called Jake to the front of the classroom. Jake could hear quiet snickers and whispered comments as he stood and walked to the presentation area. His hands were steady as he connected his datapad to the holographic display system, but his heart was beating fast. My research topic was Pre-Federation Human Military Doctrine, Jake began, his voice calm despite the nervous energy he felt. I want to start by showing you what most galactic databases contain about human warfare. The holographic display showed simple footage of human soldiers with basic projectile weapons moving in straightforward formations across open battlefields. The alien students nodded smugly, clearly feeling that their assumptions about primitive human tactics were being confirmed. This is what most species believe human warfare looked like, Jake continued. Simple weapons, basic tactics, primitive strategies. But this footage only shows the methods humans used after they joined the Federation and agreed to follow the human restriction protocols. Jake paused and looked around the classroom. His alien classmates were still smiling, expecting him to admit that humans really were as primitive as they believed. Professor Zektar leaned forward in his chair, his crystal skin beginning to darken with what Jake had learned was intense concentration. The human restriction protocols were not created because human tactics were too primitive, Jake said clearly. They were created because human tactics were too advanced for galactic civilization to tolerate. The smiles began to fade from his classmates' faces as Jake activated the classified footage. The holographic display suddenly showed human forces moving with mechanical precision across entire continents, using coordinated attacks that overwhelmed their enemies before they could react. This is called blitzkrieg, Jake explained as the class watched in stunned silence. Human forces would coordinate ground troops, armored vehicles, and aircraft to punch through enemy defenses and capture territory faster than their opponents could respond. Lyra's mouth fell open as she watched human formations that moved with efficiency rather than beauty, focused entirely on devastating effectiveness rather than artistic expression. The battle symphonies suddenly looked slow and predictable compared to the lightning-fast human attacks. Jake changed the footage to show something even more shocking. This is called combined arms tactics. Humans learned to make different types of military units work together to multiply their effectiveness far beyond what any single unit could achieve. Crix's scales turned pale green as he watched human forces using artillery, infantry, armor, and air support simultaneously to destroy enemy positions. The swift Saurian strikes looked almost gentle compared to the overwhelming firepower that human forces could bring to bear on a single target. The footage changed again, showing human forces adapting their tactics in real time as their enemies tried to counter them. Humans developed something called asymmetric warfare, Jake continued. When enemies learned to defend against one type of attack, humans would immediately create entirely new methods of fighting. Vane's ethereal form flickered with what Jake recognized as fear as he watched human forces using psychological warfare techniques that made enemy armies surrender without any telepathic abilities at all. The ethereal mind technique suddenly seemed crude compared to human methods for breaking enemy morale. "The most important thing to understand about human warfare," Jake said as he prepared to show the most shocking footage, "is that humans developed something no other galactic species had ever conceived. They called it total war." The holographic display showed cities burning, infrastructure destroyed, and entire populations forced to flee as human forces systematically eliminated their enemies' ability to wage war. The level of destruction was so complete that it made all the other banned tactics look like children's games. Professor Zektar stood up suddenly, his crystal skin now completely black. "Morrison, where did you obtain this footage?" Jake looked directly at his professor. "From the classified archives, sir. The ones that document why the human restriction protocols were necessary." The classroom was completely silent as Jake's classmates stared at the holographic display, finally beginning to understand that everything they believed about humanity had been completely wrong. Jake took a deep breath and continued his presentation as his classmates sat in stunned silence. The holographic display now showed footage that made their elegant warfare methods look like children playing with toys. He could see the fear growing in their eyes as they began to understand what humans were truly capable of when they chose not to hold back. The human restriction protocols banned 37 specific tactical methods. Jake said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. But these were not primitive tactics that needed to be improved. These were advanced methods that the Federation decided were too dangerous for civilized warfare. Jake activated another file, and the display showed something that made several students gasp. Human forces were using weather itself as a weapon, creating storms and droughts that destroyed enemy agriculture and made entire regions uninhabitable. The footage showed cities flooded by artificial hurricanes and farmland turned to desert by machines that could control rainfall. Humans developed environmental warfare, Jake explained. They learned to use the planet itself against their enemies. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, climate change, all could be weaponized to defeat opponents without ever engaging their military forces directly. Lyra's silver hair seemed to lose its shine as she watched human forces reshape entire landscapes to gain tactical advantages. Her people's battle symphonies required specific terrain formations to work properly, but humans apparently could create or destroy any terrain they needed for their operations. Jake changed the footage again, showing something even more terrifying. This is called information warfare. Humans discovered that they could defeat enemies by controlling what people believed to be true. The display showed human operatives infiltrating enemy societies and using media, education, and entertainment to gradually change how entire populations thought about reality. Enemy governments would find their own people turning against them without understanding why, as human information campaigns slowly convinced them that their leaders were corrupt or incompetent. Crix's scales had turned a sickly yellow color as he watched footage of human agents causing enemy civilizations to collapse from within. The swift Saurian strikes that his people were so proud of would be useless against an enemy that could turn Saurian citizens against their own government before any battle even began. But the most advanced human warfare method, Jake continued, was something they called peace through superior firepower. Humans would build weapons so devastating that their enemies would surrender rather than face them in battle. The holographic display showed nuclear weapons tests that turned entire islands into glass, biological weapons that could target specific genetic markers, and something called nanite swarms that could disassemble enemy equipment at the molecular level. But what truly shocked the alien students was learning that humans had built these weapons and then chosen not to use them. Humans created weapons capable of destroying all life on their home planet, Jake explained. Then they used the threat of these weapons to prevent wars rather than fight them. They called this strategy mutually assured destruction. Vane's ethereal form was barely visible now, flickering like a candle in the wind as he tried to comprehend the concept of weapons so terrible that their mere existence prevented conflicts. The ethereal mind warfare technique seemed laughably weak compared to human methods that could convince entire species to never fight again. Jake activated his final file, and the display showed a document that made Professor Zektar stand up so quickly that his chair fell over. It was the original Federation First Contact Report, classified at the highest levels and marked with warnings in multiple galactic languages. "This is why the human restriction protocols exist," Jake read from the document. "After extensive analysis of human military capabilities, this committee recommends immediate implementation of tactical restrictions on human forces. Human warfare doctrine operates on principles fundamentally incompatible with galactic civilization." Jake continued reading as his classmates listened in horrified fascination. "Where other species seek to defeat enemies, humans seek to eliminate the enemy's capacity and will to fight permanently. Human forces do not wage war to achieve political goals. They wage war to ensure that war never happens again." The document went on to describe human tactics in clinical terms that made them sound even more terrifying. Psychological operations designed to break enemy morale so completely that they would never consider fighting again. Economic warfare that could collapse entire star systems. Strategic bombing that targeted not just military forces but the industrial capacity that supported them. The Federation Council concluded that human warfare methods were too effective. Jake said, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and sadness. They ended conflicts too completely, leaving no room for the defeated to rebuild their dignity or negotiate future relationships. Professor Zektar's crystal skin was now so dark it looked almost black. "Morrison, this document is classified at levels that require council approval to access. How did you obtain it?" Jake looked directly at his professor. "My human heritage gave me automatic access to all files related to human military history. The archive keeper said it was standard policy for humans to know what their species was capable of, so they would understand why they chose restraint." The classroom was completely silent for several long moments. Finally, Lyra spoke in a voice so quiet it was barely audible. "Jake, if humans can do all of this, why did you join the Federation at all? You could have conquered the entire galaxy." Jake closed the files and looked around at his classmates. Their faces showed a mixture of fear, awe, and confusion that made him feel sad for reasons he could not quite explain. Because the most advanced human military doctrine of all is knowing when not to fight. Humans learned something in all those centuries of warfare that no other species has had to learn. "What is that?" Crix asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That winning a war and winning a peace are two completely different things," Jake replied. "The Federation did not ban human tactics because they were ineffective. They banned them because they were too effective. They ended wars too completely left. No room for enemies to become allies later." Jake gathered his materials and prepared to leave the podium. Humans joined the Federation because they learned that having the power to destroy your enemies is not the same as having the wisdom to live with them afterward. The restrictions were not punishment for being primitive. They were necessary because humans had become too good at war. As Jake walked back to his seat, the classroom remained silent. His alien classmates sat staring at the now empty holographic display, trying to process what they had learned. The human they had mocked as a primitive newcomer belonged to a species that had voluntarily restricted itself to using methods that other civilizations would consider advanced. Professor Zektar dismissed the class early, his voice shaking slightly, as he told the students to reflect on what they had learned. As the alien students filed out of the classroom, they moved quietly and avoided making eye contact with Jake. Jake sat alone in the empty classroom for several minutes, thinking about his grandfather's stories and the terrible knowledge that every human carried. He understood now why his people had accepted being seen as primitive newcomers. Sometimes the greatest strength was allowing others to underestimate you, especially when the alternative was having them fear you. The mockery had stopped, but Jake was not sure that what replaced it was any better. Fear and respect were not the same thing, and he wondered if his classmates would ever be able to see him as just Jake again, rather than as a representative of a species that could end worlds if it chose to do so. But perhaps that was the price of truth, and perhaps his classmates needed to understand that the galaxy was a more dangerous place than they had believed, protected only by the voluntary restraint of a species that had learned the hard way that some victories were too complete to be worth winning.